Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Greg Swartz. I'm the big man half of the Big Man Dram, and today's Dram is going to be some single barrel bourbon from New Riff. There you go. There's some focus. Hopefully you have something in your glass, and if you do, please feel free to throw that in the chat. Also, please feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat. I'm really excited because my guest today is Jay Erisman from New Riff Distillery. And as some of you might know, I drove across the country a few months ago. And while I was doing that, I started doing some of the research and prep work for what very well may be the next chapter in the Water of Life, or the next two chapters down, because as a lot of you probably know, we're well underway in editing the independent bottling film. But today I get to talk with Jay, who I met in August, and we became fast friends. And I'm really, really excited because, well, I think you're going to find out why. Because his enthusiasm is infectious, and I am going to shut up and bring Jay in. So let me unmute you, Jay. There you go. Welcome.
Hello, hello, hello. How are you, Greg?
I'm very well, thanks. I'm fixing to be better. In a minute, I'm going to pour this. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Doing just fine, I think.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I was very excited by not just your whiskey, but getting to know you, getting to know your story, and being at the distillery. Being at the distillery is always cool, wherever it is. You know, it's a whole next level experience. Before we get started talking, why don't I share the video, and then we can have a chat. So Jay shared with me a video that is sort of an introduction to New Riff Distilling. So if you will bear with me for a second. Wow, that's funny.
Sure.
Literally just this very second, it timed out. So there we go. Hold on a second here.
Okay, hang on. I've always wanted to do this. 3, 2, 1, action.
You got to bear with me a sec. There we go.
Hello, welcome to New Riff Distilling. My name's Jay. We've been here in Newport, Kentucky since 2014, making bourbon and rye whiskey. Let's go see how it's made. We're an urban distillery here in Greater Cincinnati. We make bourbon and rye whiskey with 6 fermenters feeding 2 copper stills. This 24-inch diameter copper beer still is a classic piece of Kentucky bourbon making equipment. On the back of our bottle, it says a new riff on an old tradition. That's the meaning of our name. We learned the old tradition, which is Kentucky sour mash whiskey making, but we want to do a new riff on it every time. We want to learn the tradition, but play it our way. And that's what we aim to do with every recipe we make. All New Riff whiskeys are bottled in bond. We recognize that to be the world's highest standard for aged brown spirits in the world. How could we not bottle everything we make at the world's highest standard? And so we do. All New Riff whiskeys are bottled without chill filtration. Chill filtration is a cosmetic filtration. We don't do that here because we don't want to diminish or attenuate any of all the good things we love about whiskey. Our bourbon is made with 65% corn, and that comes from a single-family farmer right up the road in Indiana. It is non-GMO corn. We think he's the best corn farmer in the bourbon business. Our rye whiskey is made with 95% rye, 5% malted rye. And that 95% rye comes from Brooks Grain. We think they are the best supplier of rye to the bourbon industry. The first thing we did when we built New Riff Distilling was we went looking for a more unique water supply than the city of Newport. We discovered an aquifer 100 feet below us, gives us 500 gallons a minute of very mineral rich, very hard, 58-degree water. It allows us to run every day of the year. It provides a tremendous green energy savings to our distillery. And it also provides the basis of our big, broad flavor, thanks to this big tasting water that we have. It's unique to us and very special water, we think. Thanks for joining us today at New Riff Distilling. We hope to see you soon in the future.
All right. Well, cheers to that.
Thanks, Greg. That's back before I had a beard and back when I could walk.
Yes. I noticed that as soon as I saw it. Not the walking part, but the beard part. Because I watched the video the other day.
Well, my broken leg happily is getting better, so I'll be walking eventually, and maybe then I can walk over to my razor and get respectable again. But in the meantime, I look more like you.
Everyone should. So, it's one of the things I wanted to start off by talking with you about is I know that a lot of the people that I interact with here on a regular basis are either in Scotland or Scotch single malt fans and may not know what the Bottle and Bond Act is. So I was wondering if you could talk us through a quick primer on that, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory once you hear it.
And an excellent place to start, Greg. And the very short story, especially for our friends in Scotland, is Bottled and Bond is better than your whiskey. We put on the back label, here's what I'm enjoying in my glass, is some New Riff malted rye. This is 100% malted rye. And like everything we do, it is bottled in bond. It says right here, bottled in bond without chill filtration. And we write on the back of the bottle a little bit about what bottled in bond all means. And if I can get it arrayed correctly, it's a matter of adhering to this quality standard in America and promulgated out of Kentucky. That is to this day the world's highest standard for a brown aged spirit in the world. It comes from the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And back in those days, there was a great deal of whiskey. Almost the majority of whiskey in America was blended together and cobbled together out of other whiskeys, but also other alcohols, and possibly a wide array of ingredients and flavorings and colorings and just all sorts of things that you don't really want in your whiskey. There was no formal definition for what whiskey was, and the Kentucky distillers, somewhat aghast at this, they lobbied the government for a quality standard, a protection really for whiskey. And that turned into the Bottled and Bond Act. And to be a whiskey that says upon the bottle bonded or bottled in bond, it has to adhere to a range of quality standards. And so from 1897, a whiskey distillery that wanted to put itself out as making a better article, if you will, would label it Bottled and Bond. And all these years later, since 1897, it is still the world's highest standard for quality. It's America's, if not the world's, first product definition or product quality standard that codified what a better quality level was all about. How like us in America, by the way, that the first thing we protected, the first product we went out and drew a circle around, was not the baby food, not the aspirin, it was the whiskey. Protect the whiskey first, then we can talk about baby food. But the Bottled and Bond Act ever since has been America's highest standard. And among the requirements for it are a minimum 4 years aging. It cannot be blended with anything else. It has to be aged in an oak barrel. It has to be from one distiller, and if it's bottled in one distiller but distilled at a different place, they have to disclose that on the bottle. It is a required. This is my favorite part. It has to be 100 proof. That's 50% ABV, not at a minimum, but only 100 proof, 50% ABV. It's the only standard in the world that insists on strong water, insists on a higher proof. Everything else. The minimum American proof is 40%, the same in the UK and the EU and Japan and Canada. Some countries even allow 35% ABV. And yet here's Bottled and Bond. It has to be 100 proof. So at New Riff, realizing as we were going through developing New Riff and how we would bring it to market and what this stuff would look like, we realized if we really mean it, our heart on our sleeve, that quality is coming first at New Riff, how can we not bottle everything we make as Bottled and Bond? And that's what we do. These bottles you see behind me here, sorry, I'm getting confused with the camera. These bottles over here, everything's backwards. These bottles here, all of them are Bottled in Bond. And we adhere to that standard not as simply a market segment, but as a holistic badge of quality. Everything we do is at this world's highest quality. It's higher than the standards in Scotland, which allow you to add caramel and allow you to water it down to 80 proof. It is higher than the standards in a great spirits region like cognac, where you're allowed to add some sugar solution and oak flavoring. It's higher than the standards in Japan, which it doesn't even have to come from Japan to be called Japanese whiskey. Higher than the standards in Canada, where you're allowed to put 9% of Lord knows what into the whiskey. It's the world's highest standard for quality. And so we hang our hat on that very proudly, and everything we make is bottled and bond. Indeed, it's a standard that does not exist elsewhere in the world. And so when we do go to other countries, they often are at a loss for what is bottled and bond and why is that important. The federal government defines the regulations of bottled and bond. And one of the regulations they cite is that the spirit cannot be changed from the barrel to the bottle in any way except for two things. One, of course, you are allowed to add water to bring it down to its proof of 50% ABV or 100 proof. The other thing that they do allow in the regulation, they allow that you can change the spirit through various filtration methods. And the word they use is chill proofing, which is their word for chill filtration. Which many listeners of Big Man We Dram will know what no chill filtration is, because many of the distilleries that you have covered, Greg, commit to a program of no chill filtration. Well, so does New Riff. And so in our case, we take this world's highest quality standard and raise it to another level by being bottled and bond without chill filtration. We view this as one whole contiguous quality standard. We take the world's highest standard and lift it to another level by doing it without chill filtration. So that's the long and short of why our bottles say this and why we care about it so much.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I knew a lot about bottle and bond before I met you, because, it seems to me a lot of distilleries in Kentucky will do one or two expressions that might be, but
right.
I don't know many that do everything that way. I assume it's expensive, right?
Very few distilleries do. Well, it is more expensive, primarily because it has to be 50% alcohol, 50% ABV. And so almost every distillery ever born wants to sell things at lower proof, meaning more water added, and that makes their shareholders very happy. Well, we don't have any shareholders, stockholders, any investors, anybody like that at New Riff. We have only one wonderful owner, who is Ken Lewis, the founder of New Riff, and my employer and friend for many years. And he is on the same mission as all of us whiskey makers to make great whiskey. So we do not have to answer to someone saying, I really need one at 86 proof, and could you make it 2 years old while you're at it? That's not the case at New Riff. Everything is at the world's highest quality standard, Bottled and Bond Act of 1897.
Do you think it's very rare for me, in my experience? Obviously, I've been to Kentucky twice in my life, so it's much more limited than yours. But
I didn't now, as we say.
I will. But I haven't noticed a ton of mention of chill filtration. Like, it's just not a topic that's discussed by many distilleries.
Right.
And you guys obviously wear it on your sleeve.
We do. There are more and more American distilleries, I'm pleased to say, because this has been a passion, or nay, an obsession of mine for almost 35 or so years. Once I figured out that filtration made a difference, I was fascinated by it and chased spirits without chill filtration to the extent that I could. More and more distilleries in America are taking that as a sine qua non of quality, as a badge of honor. There are some in Kentucky who commit to it across the board. Among them, Wilderness Trail does so. But most American distilleries still, like most distilleries all around the world, filter their whiskeys, chill filter them. And look, we're not saying that there's not a place for that. Chill filtration allows you to have a clear product on the shelf at a low proof. And of course, there is a place for low proof and less expensive whiskeys. Not that New Riff is what we call expensive. Our Bottled and Bond bourbon is $39.99. Manufacturer's suggested retail price. That's pretty affordable, and it's unchill filtered and 100 proof and 4 years old. But most places want to sell you things at a lower proof than that. And we just are here to make whiskey the best way we can. We believe that no chill filtration is the best way to bottle a whiskey, just as non-filtre, as they say in France, is the best way to bottle a wine, is without filtration. So we retain all of the aroma and the flavor, but also the color. Very importantly, the texture. All of this is retained in the glass and not diminished or attenuated in any way. It's the only way we know how to do business. We cannot chill filter here. We don't even have the equipment. We don't even chill filter the gin. You can see right here over my shoulder, there's a bottle right there of Kentucky Wild Gin that we make, and that's not chill filtered either. So even the gin is extra rich and extra fulsome. There's a place for no chill filtration. It is not New Riff. So.
So we've got a couple questions coming in, and I'm going to answer the first one, and I'm going to let you take the second one because it's harder.
Sure.
So we were asked, I believe this is Keith Duncan. When people post in our Facebook page, I can't see their name. When they post in our Facebook group, I can. It's just a Facebook privacy thing. But he says, I'm very naive about bourbon. Do you get cask strength releases? And yes, you do. I'm drinking one right now. This is as you will see when it racks, single barrel New Riff. And it is 53.5 ABV. So,
right. So thank you, Greg. And to follow on for a moment from the initial discussion of bottled and bond, I say everything we make is bottled and bond. That is true in the sense that every time we come out with a new whiskey, as well as our flagship bourbon and rye, those are bottled and bond. However, the single barrel that you're holding is barrel proof, as you kindly noted. And so obviously that kicks it out of being a bottled and bond whiskey. As I said earlier, bottled and bond must be 100 proof only. And so the barrel proof things that we do are of a necessity not bottled and bond. They are, everything else being equal to bottled and bond and to our other products. They are 4 years old at a minimum. We put the age statement on the back of every bottle. They always say aged at least 4 years. And we are getting out to the point now of having a few older things. This malted rye, which I am fortunate to be drinking right now, is actually a 6-year-old. So we are coming, as the years go by, with older and older things. But that barrel proof whiskey is our single barrel rye and single barrel bourbon, which you are enjoying, Greg. And those are barrel proof and thus not bottled and bond.
Well, here's the harder question for you. Because this is actually an industry question that I don't pay bills for a distillery. So I'm going to let you handle this. I'm going to put it up on the screen too. And I'll read it to anyone listening. Surely the energy cost and equipment required for chill filtration or addition of colorants must be higher than leaving it juice natural from the cask.
Great question,
it's
Bruce. That is true. However, the profits gained from adding water, right? Water like this to a whiskey far outweigh the expense of the equipment and things like that. If you can water your whiskey down to 90 proof or 86 proof or 80 proof, you will make the money back in I don't know how long, but won't take very many bottling runs to make back the cost of chill equipment, chilling equipment and filtration. And again, that is why most companies chill filter. It is not merely to gain a whiskey that is clear at room temperature, but to add water to the dram. That is why they do it. And that's mostly a profit motive. There is also, one could grant them the benefit of the doubt and say, yes, there's a stylistic desire also to offer something at a lower proof to one's consumers. But let's face it, it's mostly about profit. And I have heard from, the distillery that first fascinated me with their commitment to no chill filtration and no coloring, I might add, is the most influential whiskey distillery of our lifetimes, which is Springbank right there in Scotland. Springbank is maybe my favorite distillery in the whole wide world. It is to some extent the North Star that to the extent I was someone guiding New Riff and I still am. It is my North Star. Now, that is what I set the compass by. And they were no chill filtration from the beginning. And I recall talking with someone in Scotland and I mentioned Springbank and no chill filtration and referring to the owner, Headley right of Springbank. They said something to the effect of, he's too cheap to pay for filtration equipment. And I chuckled at that, but that's not really the truth. The truth is he's not as profit conscious, or is another term, greedy, because he doesn't add that much water to their whiskeys. If you are not chill filtering, you are probably leaving some money on the table. Look, we could sell this whiskey for every bit of well, this is malted rye. This sells for $59.99 American dollars on the shelf, and we could sell it for that if it was 100 proof or 90 proof or 80 proof. We are leaving money on the table. We probably could charge more than that too. The point being, you can easily make more money by adding more water. And anyone who doesn't chill filter is doing so partly out of a willingness to leave some money behind. And I guess we are at New Riff. Guilty as charged.
I wish to God I could remember the name of who it was, but Jenna Eli, Whiskey A Go Girl, Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, she told me a story, and I cannot remember who it was right now, about a distiller in Scotland happening to walk through the process of the end of chill filtration, and just sort of as an afterthought, took his finger across the residuals in the filter paper and tasted it, and immediately thought, why am I doing this? Like, this is incredible. Like, why did I spend all these years putting this in this whiskey, and now I'm taking it out, and what are we going to do with it? And apparently someone just the other week told me that a lot of distilleries are very, very protective of that. They destroy it immediately because they don't want that sort of connection being made in people's minds. I want to say that was something related to Glengoyne, but I honestly, I don't want to go on the, well, I just went on the record as saying that. I think it might have been Glengoyne, but I'm not sure. So I have another question, which you can answer. I can answer this one, but Michael Stewart asks, what is the formula for converting proof to ABV? And Michael, it is, for American proof, it is simply dividing by 2. Imperial proof is way more complicated. It's like pre-decimalization British money. It requires like a whole mindset.
Right. What is a shilling after all? Who in the world knows? A pence. How much is a pence? Well, today in the world, Michael Stewart, yes, everywhere, alcoholic proof is half of the alcoholic percentage by volume, ABV by volume. So 50% volume is 100 proof. Back in the yonder days of your empire, proof there was a British proof and an American proof. And I could not tell you what all those things are. I know British proof, 100 British proof used to be 57% ABV, or 114 proof American. And I don't remember what year it was. I want to say in the early 80s that the British government navigated away from that. And I'm sure somewhere on the interweb you can find a table comparing it all. But today, everywhere around the world, it is simply double. Proof is double the ABV. But America's almost the only country that really takes proof as its default statement. Almost everywhere in the world, everywhere else in the world defaults to alcoholic beverage, alcoholic content by volume.
I noticed you guys do both. I noticed here it says proof, and here it says ABV.
Right. By law, we are required to put the alcohol by volume. We put proof on as well because Americans especially expect that.
I know that this is here. I'm going to stumble into another blind alley, but I know that there was a connection between imperial proof and gunpowder, right? It was like the percentage at which gunpowder would light up. That's how they would do the test. There was something to do with the Royal Navy and testing rum strength.
I believe you are correct. Yes.
And I have to admit, I learned that at a Gordon MacPhail tasting that had 8 drams, and they talked about that at the 8th dram. And I just remember thinking, oh, this has gone right in and right out the other ear, and I'm never going to remember it. But I remember that. I remember being mad at myself for being too drunk to remember that.
But by that point, the gunpowder had already taken effect.
Yeah. The gunpowder
you were already
gone off,
already blown up. Yeah.
So now I've actually spoken to a couple of my Scottish friends, and I told them that there was an interesting, unofficial but sort of spiritual connection between you and maybe one of the distillers featured in our film. Maybe a distillery
yeah,
featured in
yeah.
the film.
You
I'll
bet.
let you
Well,
tell that story if you like.
aside from the aforementioned Springbank, who I know you visited, Greg, and perhaps we'll see some of that footage emerge eventually. But I was thrilled to see the sort of the main focus of the film be all about Bruichladdich. So next door, if you can come visit, please come and visit New Riff Distilling here in Newport, Kentucky. And right next door to us, in the parking lot, actually, is a very large liquor store, what we call in America a liquor store. And amused me always that my acquaintances in Scotland, for example, you mentioned Gordon and MacPhail, and I would ring them up and they would say, "Hey, how's the shop?" And when we speak in America of a shop, we mean a small grocer or a small, a shoe shop or a candy shop. Our liquor store back in those days, it's called the Party Source. And it is, I used to know how many square meters it was, but it's about 116,000 square feet. It's a very, very, very large shop. And so I worked there from 2001 at this very, very large liquor store. At some points, it has been the largest liquor store in the country, maybe even the world, I don't know. Anyway, I worked there, and among the many hats that I wore was as a manager of the fine spirit selection. So I was tasked with buying and ordering and seeking out and sampling and learning about and putting out for our customers all of the fine spirits of the world. I wasn't ordering the Jack Daniels or the Glenlivets, but I was going out and finding the craft things, the private casks from Gordon and MacPhail. Actually, you mentioned them earlier, also in your movie. They were the very first phone number I called when I took that job. And I said to myself, if I'm going to pull this off, there's at least one number I need to call. And so I called up Gordon and MacPhail and started working with them from that time. And one of the very early distilleries that I partnered with to bring into the store, the Party Source, was Bruichladdich. And probably in the spring of 2002, they were starting to come back to life, and their new products came back on the market. I was fascinated because I'd been a Scotch drinker since 18 years old, and loved all these great whiskeys, and I had a collection going, but I had really never clapped eyes on a bottle of Bruichladdich. It was very spottily available really in the whole wide world. It never had a consistent official or distillery release, and it just wasn't anything you ever got to try. But writers and Michael Jackson and others spoke glowingly about Bruichladdich. And so when I saw them come back on the market and come to America under new ownership, I was intrigued, to say the least, and I started bringing this in and absolutely thrilled to do more and more work with them. And here they were, this Victorian era 1885 vintage distillery, and they did so much that was common to 1885, and a lot of the equipment was the same, and they crossed that with a modern 21st century quality driven ethos of no chill filtration, no coloring, and also with that, the full panoply of innovative new things to do, including all these cask finishes, the new distillations they picked up where Springbank left off with distilling more than one whiskey. They made Bruichladdich, but they also made Port Charlotte. They made this smoky stuff. They soon turned their attention to Octomore, and it was off to the races with parts per million of peat phenols and things like that. So Bruichladdich presented me in my early career of being a liquor buyer with I kind of thought of them as a little bit of a running mate or a partner. They were kindred spirits on a quest for quality, but also on a quest to see how can we do this thing, great whiskey today? How do we do this in the 21st century? How are they going to pull off launching a new distillery, in effect, a new distillery or a new brand, even though it's 1885? How are they going to do that today? And they did it to a T. They crossed every possible line off the book and just did it perfectly. It was very well played. Quality initiative and the website, the graphics, the story they told, the communication to the consumer, everything from Bruichladdich. So they were a big influence on how I went on and worked at New Riff. What kind of a place did we want this to be? You know, if you could do that from 1885 in Scotland, how do we do it here at New Riff and be a Kentucky bourbon distillery driven for quality and committed to it in the 21st century? And a big influence was Bruichladdich. We were committed to no chill filtration, for example, because of Springbank, but we might as well have been committed to it because of Bruichladdich. They were along with Springbank, a huge influence on me and my whiskey ethos, and how I thought a whiskey distillery ought to be was really helped informed by Bruichladdich. So I visited them over the years, worked closely with them on the retail end. We had them in for tastings. Their Northern American salesperson, Representative Derek Hancock, if you're watching out there, Derek, hello, my friend, I wore the phone out with Derek, and we did some casks with Bruichladdich, a lot of tastings. Jim McEwen came in and did a legendary tasting for us at the Party Source. So they were really, really close to us there in the days of running the Party Source. Later, of course, to start New Riff, the owner of the Party Source, Ken Lewis, had to sell the store, and he did. He sold it to his employees. So next door to us today, right over there, is a titanically large, it's even bigger than before, liquor store owned by its employees. And next door to what I hope is an up-and-coming whiskey distillery here in Newport. That's New Riff. So big friends of us there on the Rins of Isla, and I can't wait to get back.
Well, I did not know that. You know, when I went in to meet you, you know, that was completely a coincidence that this, you know, that you and I had found inspiration from the same source. You know, and
I was beside myself that someone went into Scotland and told the story of Scotch that way. Didn't go to, well, let's see, it started with George J.G. Smith in the Glen of the Livet in 1824. That's a great way to tell a story too, but that's not the way you told it. And I was swept off my feet really by your film, Greg. And
oh, thank you.
I wouldn't have told it any different myself, I suppose.
Well, anyone who's ever been in any of Jim McEwen's tastings knows that was how we had to begin the film, because the guy, a friend of ours who is our post-production supervisor, he supervised the edit. He drinks whiskey, but he doesn't know a lot about it. He's not a whiskey anorak or anything. He watched that footage and he came and he said, I don't know what that guy's saying, but that needs to be the opening scene of your movie.
Cool.
So we had a question here, a comment here about whoever picked the aqua blue color for Classic Laddie is a genius. And I don't honestly know who that was. I assume it was Mark Renier. Certainly would have signed off on it. But I will tell you this. They'll tell you that they picked it because you can see that color in Lockendall all the time. And if you look below me on this screen, you will see this is Lockendall. Well, my finger goes off, but that's Lockendall. And you can totally see that color in the water there. And if you look across Lockendall when you're at Bruichladdich, you see it on a sunny day. And the picture in the background here is not the Rins of Isla, it's the other side of Isla, but it's still, you know, only a few miles away. And I always think it's the smart move on that bottle is when you walk into the biggest bar in the world, from across the bar, you can immediately tell if they have Classic Laddie on the shelf, because it doesn't blend in with everything else. Speaking of which, I think you guys have a very interesting bottle, which I have to tell you, I know I told you this, but I love the design of your bottle. I hate the height of your bottle because it doesn't fit on my liquor cabinet. I mean, it's totally unique. It's sort of a bit two bottles in one, which I know is sort of your ethos as well. You know,
right.
Old and new.
You know, it says on the back of the bottle, Greg, a new riff on an old tradition. And that tradition, in our case, being sour mash Kentucky whiskey making, the style of whiskey making that Kentucky codified and helped bring to the world, sour mash. So that is the tradition. But the new riff comes from a musical analogy. Ken Lewis, the owner of the company. I wish I could say I came up with it, because I'm a guitar player and I make riffs. But it was Ken Lewis's idea. He thought of the distiller as a musician who knows the tradition and plays it all the time, but they change it up a little bit. They play a little different. They play a new riff, And so that's the meaning of the name, a new riff on an old tradition. And so the bottle, we also wanted to encapsulate old and new, this tension. It's a creative and a productive tension, a happy tension between old and new. There are old elements, the shape of the bottle. I'm sorry it's so tall. The tax stamp at the top, the embossment in front that I love to feel when I pour it. But then there's this sleek logo and the font, the sleek ombre as it's called, definitely modern aspects as well. It's a new and an old bottle all in one. And I'm pleased to say you can adequately spot it from across the bar as well. I was afraid being maybe sort of dark, it would kind of blend in, and I have to say it doesn't. I can walk in a bar and from far across the room, I can say, oh, thank goodness they've got New Riff. We'll drink well tonight.
Jim McEwen would tell you should have made the whole thing opaque, because he told us that the best thing about the opaque whiskey bottle is that you can steal your friend's whiskey and they don't know how much you've stolen. Well, I think he said, I think your spouse, I think is what he said.
Remind me not to leave a bottle around Jim unattended in that case.
Alan Logan, who's the production director at Brookloudie now, he said to us something that was really interesting, which is he said, we benefited from our neglect. And he said, had we not been neglected by so many owners for so long, bit by bit, all of the original equipment would have been replaced because it was inefficient. And the only thing the only sizable thing that they've ever replaced is they said that the grist mill used to be powered by a donkey walking in a circle. The donkey has been retired, or maybe it was a mule. I don't know, but it was an animal. He said, there's no way any modern business of any era would have just continued using when piece X broke, they would have replaced it with a more modern piece, and that never happened. And they sort of, stumbled across it by pure dumb luck. I think even in a way more luck than people realize, because I think Murray McDavid, Mark and Simon Coughlin, they tried to buy Ardbeg before they bought Brookloudie, and they got outbid. Mm-hmm. And Simon Coughlin told me we were lucky that we got outbid for Ardbeg, because we were a better fit for Brookloudie, because the spirit at Brookloudie is more flexible and we wanted to experiment. Whereas Ardbeg, which I love, is very Ardbeg. It is what it is. Yeah. And that had they been kind of pinned into that corner, they would have been doing peated whiskey across the board, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And look at the trouble they went to when I think several years ago they had to replace or rebuild significantly at Brookloudie parts of the mash tun, this cast iron behemoth, and the forks that go around and around that stir up the mash. They had to redo a lot of that, and I believe they found, astonishingly enough, the same supplier was still extant in, I think it was Glasgow. And they recreated a lot of these parts, but it was really a challenge to not just put it in an entirely new 21st century mash tun, but to preserve that old piece. Anyone who's restored an old car can know how hard it can be to find this and find that and have the right parts to keep the patina and the historical authenticity. Say, I was talking about the name and everything and where it comes from. Ian Bruce asks. Yeah,
I was going to share that when you got,
right. What genre of music would be representative of New Riff? Right. Great question. And musician that I am, I have an opinion in this. So Ken Lewis, who the owner of New Riff, came up with the name. He's an old deadhead. I think when I was born, he was literally on the road in a Volkswagen bus following the Grateful Dead around America, an old deadhead. And so he is this child of the 60s. And that's what his ethos was really coming out of it. And I always thought of it as New Riff tried to align that indeed with a genre of music or something. And at the risk of seeming old-fashioned or stuck in the 60s, guitarist that I am, I play Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton songs and things like that. I view us as very much in that kind of a mold. We are not, if New Riff can be interpreted musically, and by the way, we downplay it a little bit. We try not to be the music distillery. We play that down, and we want to be taken seriously, and we are inspired by that, but we are not really here to push music out on people. But we're not a punk rock distillery. I love me some punk rock. It was a very necessary step, I think, a very healthy cultural shift that happened in the 70s. Something had to make Electric Light Orchestra go away. You know, it was a healthy thing, rock and punk rock, but they were sweeping out the old and bringing in something new, and they wanted to tear down the old order. I'm speaking here with a very broad brush, but that was the ethos of punk rock, and that's not what we're about at all. We want to learn the tradition. Sour mash whiskey making, like I said before. We want to learn and stand on this old tradition, but then play a new riff upon it. So we're very much more in the mold of someone like a Clapton, who first learned the blues backwards and forwards and joined the Yardbirds, joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers and played the blues, and then made a tremendous new riff with the Cream. Hendrix is an even better example. Jimi Hendrix, if you know your Hendrix history, played in the American South on what was called the Chitlin circuit, played behind all these rhythm and blues artists, the Isley Brothers, backed up Little Richard. He was in Little Richard's band, backed up B.B. King. He played the blues night to night, paycheck to paycheck existence for years before eventually making his way to London and becoming the Jimi Hendrix Experience and blowing the whole world up. So they learned the tradition and then they made the new riff. And that's what we have done. We learned to make this whiskey tradition. We learned making a lot of rye whiskey. We have a commitment at New Riff to rye as our sort of house grain or signature grain. We actually mash on an annual basis more rye grain than we do corn, a state of affairs that has never existed in Kentucky distilling before, I'm sure. So we play these new riffs and yet are very much informed by the old tradition, just like the classic rock of the 60s. And over the years, our riffs become heavier and heavier and heavier until we are banging our heads, so to speak. So sit tight. We have some things coming down the pike that get more and more hairy.
Well, would you like to talk about the one we talked about? Because I think some of these...
Right. So yeah.
Because one of the things in our film that I love, that when Mark Renier says, you know, it was, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this. Now it's all, we have, you know, Chateau Wagga Wagga. We've actually talked about having T-shirts made that say Chateau Wagga Wagga. But, you know, and I think you guys are doing the same thing where you're sort of pushing back against this sort of old guard in some ways. And I'll let you tell this story.
Right. Well, right. We are thrilled to push back, if you will, against the old guard. There's not anyone stopping us, and no one is offended. Everyone here in Kentucky welcomes innovation as well. And we are starting off sometimes with riffs that are a little more subtle. For example, the entire bottled and bond without chill filtration concept. This whole paradigm is its own riff on an old tradition. Few traditions in Kentucky whiskey are more hallowed and old than bottled and bond. And here we are putting a 21st century quality riff on it to be without chill filtration. So that's a very subtle little riff. But the riffs also get, as I said, heavier and heavier. One of them has to do with the very essence of that whiskey making tradition I mentioned earlier called sour mash whiskey making, or what we call in a more holistic fashion, the Kentucky regimen, the entire regimen around making whiskey in Kentucky. It's sour mashing, which involves holding back some of the prior days stillage or what some distillers called slop, the stuff that goes out to be fed to the animals, saving some of that back to be incorporated in a future batch. That's called setting back some of the sour mash, and that's sour mashing. But there's more to it than that. The use of open fermentation is important. Distilling on the grain is very important. Our column still that we use, it's a different kind of column still than a coffee still or a Scottish or Irish grain still. We distill on the grain. The grain goes through the still and all the way down. And so we distill on the grain. All of this summed up is the Kentucky regimen, and often shorthandedly referred to as sour mash. So everything we make at New Riff is sour mash whiskey. We don't make sweet mash. We only make sour mash. And that means that the last batch of whiskey, or yesterday's batch of whiskey, if you will, informs the next batch of whiskey or today's batch. So there was of a time, a day when we came in And the only back set we had, the only stillage that was set back from the prior day happened to be, takes a deep breath, from a batch of 100% peated malted barley, Scottish peated malted barley that we had imported. And I see Russell's question about importing any grain. I'll get to that in a little bit, but yes, that one was very well imported. We had, in fact, distilled a batch of 100% Scottish peated malted barley through our column still. And thus we were left with this back set that was peated. And I recall the discussion that happened the morning we mashed the next batch of whiskey. Actually, the first thing we mashed that day was a rye, and then we mashed a bourbon. And our assistant distiller came up, and myself and our head distiller, Brian Sprance, were standing there. And our assistant distiller, David Miller, said to Brian, the head distiller, something to the effect of, "Hey, boss, do you want us? Should we use this peated back set? I mean, it's very different stuff. Should we use this?" And Brian, in a moment of clarity, said something to the effect of, "Fuck it, let it ride, let it go. Let's just try it." And we mashed that day's production with peated back set. And we didn't do it knowing it would make a difference, thinking it would make a difference, least of all planning that it would make a difference, or expecting someday that we would have a smoky whiskey as the result. We just got on with the business at hand, which was making whiskey that day. And it happened to be with this peated back set. And about 4 years go by. And one day we are there tasting the whiskey samples and going through them. And we put this one sample across the panel, and we're tasting it. We said, what the heck? What in the world is this? Oh my goodness. It is that peated back set whiskey. It snuck up on us. And we had found that 4 years later, yes, that peated back set did inflect and flavor the whiskey. And we made a peaty rye and a peaty bourbon, but it's not fair to call them peated. In America, when we make a bourbon, it's mostly made out of corn, minimum of 51% corn. And it has other grains added to it. And when one of those grains is wheat, we call that a wheated bourbon. And there are famous wheated bourbons on the market. Wheated bourbon. So if one made let's say an oated bourbon with some oats, you would put oat grain in the whiskey, right? If you made a peated bourbon, you would put peated grains into the mash, right? This is not peated bourbon that I'm describing here. It was a whiskey with nary a grain of peated barley in the mash. It was only made with peated back set. And so it was only flavored with that back set. There was no peatiness anywhere coming through it except through the very old time Kentucky tradition of peated, of sour mash whiskey. And so behind me on the shelf, it's over, where is it? Right about there. There is a bottle on the shelf called Backsetter. And Greg, you were so blessed as to be given a dram. I have a bottle of it. When you visited, I said, let me lay it on you. And so I enjoy surprising people who know about Scotch whiskey, and certainly you do. We made this peaty bourbon and peaty rye, but not by adding peated grain, only by almost a magic trick. It's almost an impossible whiskey. How do you make something peaty without adding peated barley malt to the mash? And this is how you do it. You add it in the back set. And it was something, again, that was completely happenstance, just a quotidian daily whiskey production. And yet when you are an enterprising whiskey distillery doing new riffs and being open to innovation all the time, like New Riff is, these are the things you find, is that you walk in one day and the only back set you have is peated, and look what follows is an amazing product called Backsetter. So the Backsetter project was a release of two whiskeys. This was 2 years ago it came out. Came out in June of 2020. It was in the pandemic. And we have made it again. It will be repeated someday. but we can't make very much of it at all because any of this backsetter peated whiskey that we make depends on first making a batch of peated malted barley. And how much of that do you really think we need? The answer is not very much. So we have, like I said, a lot of new riffs coming down the pike, and they get wilder and wilder as years go by. But that was the wildest thing we ever made.
You could buy backset from Lafroig, get it on a plane and get it to you right away within 24 hours, because they probably have tons of it that they're not using.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny. Russell Brinklow has made a comment here, which I've actually had. I've had the Glenlivet that was done with this, where they flavored with peat by using a cask that had held peated whiskey before, and the Nadura, one of the Glenlivet Naduras had the peated cask, and I've had that and quite enjoyed it, and was speaking about it this morning.
Russell, that's the easy way to do it. Anybody can do that. You can ring up a cask broker and get a barrel of peated delivered tomorrow, probably. We wanted to do it. Well, like I said, we didn't want to do it at all. It just happened. We didn't do it expecting that there would be a flavor. And by Jove, there was. We did it the hard way. No, and anyone can do that. I thank you for your note, but that's the easy way. We don't do things easy here. To Russell's question about importing grain, it's all domestic grain. It's domestic corn. It comes from Indiana. It's just about 100 miles up the road, our corn farmer. Our rye actually comes mostly from Northern Europe. It is a specification of rye that our rye supplier sends to us that allows us to make 95% rye whiskeys. And it comes from Northern Europe. Often, I guess the pick of the litter is Sweden, but it also can be German, Danish, sometimes rye. And also this whiskey I'm enjoying now, our 100% malted rye. This malted rye actually comes to us from Germany. In Germany alone, they have a real tradition of rye beers, Rogen, they call them. And ales that are made with rye. And that's the one place we could go to 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago, when we made the first batches of our 100% malted rye. In order to find enough malted rye to make this whiskey, we had to go all the way to Germany. And so that's where that one comes from.
I'm always intrigued why rye whiskey isn't hugely popular in Northern Germany and Scandinavia, because the rye breads, are so popular there. Rye crackers and crisp. It's just a really popular thing there. And but I think there's a potential market there for that. Having been in Germany 3 times in the last few years, and I've eaten so much rye bread while I've been there and loved it.
Right. Well, there are notably some rye distillers in Scandinavia, in all the Scandinavian countries, Denmark included. There are some people there really doing some things with rye. It's probably the sort of linchpin of pan-European rye production.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I have a. Well, look, the truth is, my friend Bill Varnell, who runs the Whiskey, Bourbon, and Scotch Enthusiast Facebook group, he said to me, people ask me, he said, bourbon people come to me and say, why do you drink all that Scotch? And Scotch people come to me and say, why do you drink all that bourbon? And he said, he gives the same answer to everyone. He's like, I like whiskey, period. And I'm the same way. I like rye, I like bourbon, I like Scotch, I like Irish whiskey, I like Japanese whiskey, I like peat, I like unpeated whiskey. I like stretching myself in those different ways. Mm-hmm. And I'm always excited to find new flavors and stuff that you can get out of having a peated backset, for example. So here we have a really good question from Lynn Schatz, which I'm going to put up here. What's different about European rye that makes it preferable to Canadian or Minnesota rye? Right.
Great question. Well, when we went about learning from. We had a consultant. I saw him today. He was in the building just picking up some whiskey. A consultant master distiller that helped us get started at New Riff and spec'd out a lot of the building and designed a lot of the process. He's taught us, instructed us in how to run the place safely, not blow ourselves up. Taught us so much about making great whiskey. And his name is Larry Ebersald, and he was individual master distiller responsible for inventing and quite literally mastering the famous 95% rye recipe out of Indiana, not far from us, only about a half an hour away from us, actually, that has come to so represent modern rye whiskey in America. It's a recipe of 95% rye, 5% malted barley. And it's probably the hardest whiskey style in the world to make is rye whiskey, because rye is such a finicky grain. It is sort of slimy. It has some oils in there. It foams up in the fermenter. It gums up the still. It requires extra cleaning. It's a pain in the butt to make. All the old time distillers here, they hated making rye. Well, we loved making rye. We were taught these black magic tricks by Larry Ebersol, the master, about how to make it. And one of his specifications for pulling it off, because that's an extremely high rye percentage. Most ryes in Kentucky historically would have been something like 55% rye. And in America, if you got up to 75% rye in a mash bill, that would be a lot. Well, he took it to the limit, 95% rye. And in order to make that work, you needed to have just the right specification of rye. And he got it out of this various rye supplied to him out of Northern Europe. It had a lot to do with the cleaning of the grain. When you clean a grain, you put it on a large sieve, like as big as a dining room table, and it's a screen really, and the screen is large enough for the rye to fall through the screen, but to trap all of the sticks and rocks and things like that on the screen. And so you shake the screen back and forth and the rye falls through. And by progressing this through different sizes of screens, you clean the grain. And they found that working with this particular specification of Swedish rye, but it later applied to these other sources as well, they could pull off the 95% rye recipe. So when we went to make our riff on that rye recipe, our version is 95% rye, 5% malted rye. So we call it 100% rye. When we did our riff on that tradition, we needed really of a purpose to use the same specification. So that's why. It doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, Canadian rye, they grow a lot of rye in Canada. It doesn't necessarily mean that the European stuff was better, but for this specific purpose, it was much better suited than the domestic rye we could get. There's also a very well greased path for that rye to come to the American bourbon industry. It's actually probably more affordable to select that rye than to select one that comes from Canada on a truck versus comes from Europe on a ship and ultimately a barge coming all the way up the Mississippi River. But suffice it to say, there's both some economic but mostly qualitative differences between those rye supplies.
That's a really good question. It's fun. At the beginning of that statement, though, Jay, I really enjoyed he taught us a lot about making great whiskey. Don't blow yourself up. That's number one in the checklist.
Number one, yeah.
That pretty much makes the rest of the points moot. So Lynn has a follow-up question, and then I think we'll wrap this up. I always say it's a half an hour. We've gone a full hour, and I haven't. Right. It flew by for me because I'm learning stuff. But here, let me ask you this follow-up question: processing more than rye varietal.
Right. Well, rye varietal, it's often difficult to specify a rye and what variety you're getting. We could find out, but rye is it's a pretty consistent grain, as opposed to many grains around the world, most notably wheat. Wheat has had a lot of flavor over the last century plus, 150, 130 years. A lot of flavor has been bred out of wheat because they have bred wheat to become white flour, basically, to make a long story short. And this is the topic, Greg, of our next Dram vlog, which is about heirloom grains. Let's talk about that someday. But the fact with rye is that modern rye varietals taste pretty much just as good as old time rye varietals. They do taste different. We know that because, again, on the shelf behind me over there is a bottle of Balboa rye. That is an heirloom rye varietal dating from 1933. and it absolutely tastes different than our regular rye whiskey that we make. So we don't specify a varietal of rye. We are specifying more the specifications for its production and moisture content, falling weight, all of the very many very nerdy specifications about a grain, and not so much the varietal. And rye, I don't mean that varietal doesn't matter, but you're going to get a nice, recognizable, excellent rye whiskey out of really any varietal of rye in the world today. You will get slightly different flavors, and we haven't really seen a lot of difference in season to season or year to year with our rye supply. But we do make an heirloom rye ourselves, and that absolutely delivers a different flavor.
So we have a question here from Michael Stewart, and let me tell you before you answer, Jay, he's not just asking as a whiskey drinker. He is the owner of the Inverary Whiskey Shop, which was the Whiskey Shop of the Year in Scotland last year. So
Inverary, yeah.
Inverary.
Yes.
There's two Invers.
Okay.
There's Inverary and Inverary.
I'm sorry. I wandered through of a time many years ago. Wandered through the whiskey shop in Inverary. I have not been, to my detriment, I am sure. Inverary.
Yes.
At any rate, yes, Michael Stewart, a wonderful up and coming importer named N10 is our supplier, and N10, and I can't tell you his contact off the top of my list. If there's any way to follow up on that, I would be happy to. N10bourbons.com is his, and that's the letter N, the numerals 10 bourbons.com. But I would suggest starting there, N10 Bourbons.
I have not been to their whiskey shop yet either, because it's up near Aberdeen. It's in northeastern Scotland, and I've not been. That's the only part of Scotland I've not been to. That's not true. There's a lot of islands. There's so many islands in Scotland. You could spend the rest of your life going to them. But, here he said close enough. We have people in Scotland who still get us mixed up. I imagine. Yes, but
right.
That's. Go ahead.
I'll tell you his email, Michael. His name is Nathan. Lovely chap. We have enjoyed working with him. He's been great for us. N10bourbons.com, and his first name is Nathan. So his email is Nathan at N10bourbons.com. That's N as in Nancy, 10bourbons.com. And that's his email. And I know he'd love to hook someone up in Scotland.
Well, I will vouch for the whiskey, because it's quickly become one of my favorite bourbons. And I have to say, I'm out of your rye, but I absolutely love your rye. And that's the reason I'm out of it. I got to be honest with you. Brad and I got 2 bottles of rye from you that day, and I don't think either one of them made it out of Kentucky. We were there for 4 days, so and maybe one of them made it out. Yes, you know what? Brad flew home with his. We finished mine off and then remember the airline lost his whiskey, but then he found it. So
right,
all's well that ends well. Anyway, Jay, thank you so much. I haven't done this in a few months, and this is so awesome to come back and do this with you. It's so much fun.
Thanks, Greg. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. If you have any other questions, please write to me or put them in the chat. I always check the chat for days afterwards, because we get lots of views after the fact. So I always keep track on both the Facebook and the YouTube. So thanks, everyone. Oh, and by the way, next week I will have Scott Bruneau of the Scotch Test Dummies, late of Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, as my guest. So I'll be posting about that in the next day or two, and I will see you then. Bye.
Thank you.